So let's talk about the Hagia Sophia being made a mosque again. The Hagia Sophia is the most famous church in the Eastern Orthodox world. And with that, you have the fact that Constantinople, Istanbul, is technically it's the head of the Eastern Orthodox world. In theory, it's the head of the Orthodox world. Technically speaking, it's the head of the Orthodox world, the Ecumenical Council under the Patriarch Bartholomew I. Yeah, it's the head of the Orthodox world. Fine. In practice, though, Russia is the dominating force of the Orthodox world. When Christians were being butchered in Syria and Iraq, they weren't looking to Istanbul. They weren't looking to Alexandria. They weren't looking to Athens for help. They were looking to Moscow for help and for hope. Why? Because Moscow has a huge military, and the Orthodox Church has an entire military apparatus by its side. There is strength in the Orthodox world in Russia. There is strength. And without Russia, well, the rest of the Orthodox world is pretty helpless. What do you have? Greece. Greece is under the boot of the Germans. What do you have? Egypt. Egypt has a Christian minority that is completely under the mercy of a Muslim majority. What else do you have? We have Constantinople. Yeah. Completely under the control of the Turk. So without Russia, the Orthodox world is pretty much helpless. So yes, on paper, the Constantinople Patriarchate is the head of the Orthodox world. But in reality, in practice, to put it nicely, Russia is the leading force in the Orthodox world. Because if there's a big war and the Turks decide to invade Greece, you're not going to be looking to Alexandria for help. You're going to be looking to the Russians for help and for security. Russia gives hope to the Christian world because it has this Christian face, and a lot of people see the Orthodox Church in Russia as something very beautiful, very, very holy, very traditional. So there's a lot of strength behind just the very idea of the Russian Orthodox Church. When people think about it, they think, oh yes, Putin, the Russian military, they can help Christendom. No one thinks about Istanbul. So Russia is the dominating force in the Orthodox world. Now, with that said, for decades, there has been a rivalry between Moscow and the Patriarchate in Istanbul. There has been a rivalry, and the Russians have been trying to really take over the Orthodox world, and they have the means to do so. They have that capacity. I mean, they have this, giant military force. They have a lot of geopolitical leverage. They have a lot of influence. They have quite a geopolitical position in the world. And there has been this competition, who's gonna rule, who's gonna have the most influence in the Orthodox world. A great example of this is what happened in the 1990s. In the early 1990s, Estonia, the Estonian Apostolic Orthodox Church, wanted independence from the Moscow Patriarchate. Now, for a long time, the Estonian, I have to keep saying this, the Estonian Apostolic Orthodox Church had autonomy. Well, the Soviet Union invaded Estonia in 1940, and then in 1945, the Russian Orthodox Church abolished the Estonian Church's autonomy. In 1991, the Estonians requested from Bartholomew I autonomy from the Moscow Patriarchate, and Bartholomew I granted them that independence, that autonomy. The Russians were so angered by this that in 1996, the Russians decided to sever ties from Constantinople. And this was the schism of 1996. Now, Orthodox people today are always talking about, Rome broke away from the true church in the East. You guys still have huge schisms. 1996, you guys had a schism. It's pretty crazy. Now, it was resolved, but the anger, the rivalry, the tension, the conflict, it still remained. And that is demonstrated in the fact that there was just recently another schism between the Russians and Constantinople over Ukraine. Because what happened in 2018, the Patriarchate of Constantinople, the head of the Orthodox world, Bartholomew I, he told the Ukrainians, you guys can have your own church. You guys can be independent from the Moscow Patriarchate. The Ukrainians were like, glory to the soldiers, glory to Ukraine. Yes, we're going to have our own church. And the Russians are like, no, you can't do that. Bartholomew I, no, we don't like you anymore. You are bastard. We're going to sever ties with Constantinople. No, no more. Moscow now #1. We don't need you. We don't need you. You are slave of Turk. And so the Russians severed ties. Right now we have another schism. And this schism is ongoing and has not been resolved. The Russians didn't just stop there. They said, hey, if you are a Russian Orthodox Christian, you are not allowed to go into any church for communion, for baptism, for marriage, if that church is under the Constantinople Patriarchate. You're not allowed. The Greek Orthodox Church decided to recognize the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Moscow said, hey, we're severing ties from you. The church in Alexandria in Egypt decided to recognize the Ukrainian church. Moscow was like, you're gone, pal. You can't be with us any longer. Egypt, you guys are a slave to Muslim. We're not going to help you no more. We're not going to be with you no more. No, to hell with you. And that was that. So what does this all mean? What it means is that Moscow, the Patriarchate of Moscow, couldn't care less about the head of Orthodox Church in Istanbul. They couldn't care less. That whole technicality stuff of, well, technically, Bartholomew is the first amongst equals, that stuff goes out the window with the Russians. They don't give a damn. In fact, they're looking for any opportunities to consolidate their power and to make their Orthodox presence grow even more, to leverage their power even more over the Patriarchate in Istanbul. They don't give a damn. The Russians want to be the head. That's why they're severing ties from these other churches because, hey, Russia doesn't really need them. They need Russia. The Orthodox world needs Russia. That's the bottom line. You can say, well, no, we have Greece and we have Alexandria. Yeah, the Greeks are under the boot of the Germans. The Egyptians are completely at the mercy of Muslims. Russia is the only Orthodox country that has a serious military force and that has serious muscle power. It's not just, oh, I signed the encyclical here and the bishop, so no. If the Orthodox world is invaded by Turkey, people are not going to look to Istanbul for help. They're not going to look to Bartholomew for help. They're going to look for hope from Moscow. When Christians were being butchered in Syria and Iraq, they weren't looking to Istanbul, they weren't looking to Athens, they weren't looking to Alexandria for hope and for help and security, they were looking to the Russians. So really, in practice, it's the Russians that are dominating the Orthodox world right now. Zeal, vibrancy, all of that Christian energy, it can be felt and seen in Russia, bottom line. So Russia knows that it can eclipse the Patriarchate in Istanbul. It knows this. And when Bartholomew said, okay, Ukraine, you can have your own church, Bartholomew didn't get up in the morning and say, hey, I really want the Ukrainians to have their own church. For 400 years, the Ukrainians were under the Moscow Patriarchate. Those guys need their own church too. I feel really bad for them. Like Bartholomew wasn't doing that. He didn't drink his black tea and decide, oh yeah, I'm going to give these guys a church. That's not what happened. What happened was Bartholomew and the whole Constantinople Patriarchate was pressured by the Turks to make this Ukrainian church thing happen. The Turks did this because the Turks were pressured to do so by the Americans. Why? Because Turkey was having sanctions imposed on their country. Turkey had sanctions imposed on it by the United States. The Americans were imposing sanctions on the Turks. Turkey, of course, wanted the sanctions lifted. And America said, okay, you want the sanctions lifted? Pressure the Constantinople Patriarchate to allow the Ukrainians to have their own church. Now, why would the Americans give a damn about some inner church politics, America doesn't care about that. America cares about maintaining its empire and maintaining its hegemony, because by making that Ukrainian Orthodox Church, you are stoking and provoking Ukrainian nationalist sentiment against the Russians. It was a Gladio operation through and through. Gladio is a NATO program. It's all about boosting nationalism against Russia. That was what it was in the Cold War, and a lot of the things from the Cold War haven't ended. We saw that in the 1990s with the destruction of Yugoslavia. The idea of making a Ukrainian church, it was all about just pissing off the Russians and fragmenting Russia's ecclesiastical influence over Ukraine. So that's why that happened. That's why that happened. It wasn't very widely reported, but that's the reality of what took place. Now, Erdogan, he completely supported the idea. It wasn't like he didn't want to do it. No, he wanted that to happen because Turkey and Russia are big enemies. Russia is the biggest enemy of Turkey. Russia and Turkey have had 7 wars against each other in the past. Turkey lost all of them. So it's quite obvious to see which country is the big threat to Turkey. It's Russia. The whole thing with Crimea, right there on the Black Sea, Turkey and Russia are fighting over who's going to control the Black Sea. Crimea is inhabited by many Muslim Turks who have a lot of allegiance to the government of Turkey, and Turkey is going to use that as a proxy against Russia. It's already happening. So you have that. And Erdogan completely supported the idea of creating this Ukrainian Orthodox Church. In fact, he did so because he knew that it was a way to get an edge, to get an advantage against the power and authority and influence of the Moscow Patriarchate. In fact, there was a Tatar leader. I believe he's a member of the Ukrainian parliament. And he said that he actually met with Erdogan, and I think he actually told Erdogan, with the creation of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Istanbul is actually going to rule the Orthodox world. So this decision by the Turks to push Bartholomew to make the Ukrainian independent Orthodox Church, that was a way to get Istanbul to have an advantage, to have an edge above Moscow. It's a geopolitical propaganda war, and it's not just with violence. It's also, a war is also done through the institutions of churches. Any institution by which you can spread influence, any conduit for influence, countries are going to use those conduits to their advantage in whatever struggle they're in against the country that they don't like. So when we look at this story of the Hagia Sophia being made into a mosque again, we have to look at it within this context. How does this affect the Patriarchate of Istanbul? Doesn't help it, because it actually makes the Patriarchate of Istanbul look more irrelevant than it already is. It further makes it weak. It further delegitimizes it. Not exactly delegitimize, but it weakens the position of the Istanbul, the Constantinople Patriarchate. The Orthodox world is now going to look to Russia for hope to liberate the Orthodox world from Turkey. They're going to look up to Russia. So this actually helps Russia, because now the Orthodox world is going to cling on to Russia even more. And this also helps the Moscow Patriarchate, because, again, you have to look at it within the context of the Moscow-Istanbul rivalry. And we're talking at the ecclesiastical level. Moscow, for decades, has wanted to override Istanbul, ecclesiastically speaking. And this helps that cause, because now it's like, hey, your big church over there, it's no longer a museum, it's a mosque. Over here in Russia, we got thousands of churches, beautiful churches, and there's no Turks controlling us. So it's going to empower that Moscow Patriarchate. All at the same time, it's going to weaken the position of the Istanbul Patriarchate. and it's going to make Moscow look like the hero. So that's the context that I'm seeing this all in. So that's my thoughts for this particular event. I actually wrote an article about this. I will post the link of this article underneath the video so you can watch it. And yeah, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.